Hey guys, I want to tell you a little bit about shutter speed today. But before I can talk to you about shutter speed, I need to talk to you about exposure. And exposure is the light that makes up a photograph. And remember, photography is just recorded light. And there are three things that affect the exposure. That is the ISO, which we'll talk about later, the shutter speed, and the aperture. And now two of these should sound pretty familiar to you because of the pinhole photography. So the aperture is what? Excellent. It is the hole that lets light in. Fantastic. You guys are so smart. And the shutter is what controls the duration of time, or the duration of time that lets the light in. So if you were to think about the exposure as water, right? And the shutter is essentially a faucet. If you were to turn the faucet on and off really fast with a really short shutter speed, not a lot of water would go through. But if you turn the faucet on for a long time, a lot more water would go through the faucet. And that's what I want you guys to think about today. Okay, so shutter speed is essentially the time or the duration that the light sensors or the image is exposed to light. So when we are in the dark room, the duration of time was determined by how long you opened the shutter on your pinhole camera manually when you flipped that little piece of cardboard back to let light go through the aperture. But in digital photography, it is how quickly or how slowly the sensors inside the camera are exposed to light. So, knowing what you already do about shutters and pinhole photography, exposures, decisive moment, all that stuff, what do you think shutter speed will affect? What can we infer about shutter speed? Great, excellent. If you guys haven't yet, please watch this video. But the shorter the shutter speed is, the darker the image. The longer the shutter speed is, the lighter the image. So if you look at these pictures of candles, the f-stop or the aperture, so the aperture size is the same on all of these. The ISO is the same, and we'll talk about that later. The only thing that is changing is the shutter speed. So the one in the top left is 1/250th of a second. That's a really, really short amount of time. And look at how dark it is. Versus the one in the bottom right-hand corner is 1/2 of a second, which is significantly more time than 1/250th of a second. And notice how the 1/2 of a second is brighter. So the longer the shutter speed, the lighter the image, the more light that comes through. The shorter the shutter speed, the darker the image because less light comes through, just like the faucet. The quicker you turn the faucet off, the less water that goes through. The longer you have that faucet open, the more water comes through. The other thing that shutter speed affects is the amount of blur. So when you guys were doing decisive moments, you'll notice that your camera was probably taking pictures rather quickly. There was a fast shutter speed. And what that does is it freezes time, or it freezes things mid-action, while a slow shutter speed will kind of track the whole movement or the whole motion, and there'll be a blurred effect. So notice slower shutter speed has more blur. If you've ever seen a picture of someone and they look blurry, it's because they are moving faster than the shutter speed. So we're going to be doing a little light painting, or you guys can do some light painting. And you've probably seen stuff like this before, particularly with people who drew pictures with sparklers. So essentially what happens is the person who's taking the photo puts their camera on a tripod, and it has to be on a tripod. Why? excellent because there will be too much blur, because for a long shutter speed, you're going to be moving that camera around quite a bit, even if you're not intentionally meaning to. Or maybe you do want to do it handheld and get quite a bit of a blur. I don't know. It's up to you. And then what happens with this is, so the camera's on a tripod, and this person took some sort of a light source, and it looks like maybe a glow stick or something like that, and they kind of traced the image all around the shoes before the camera took its picture. Because it had a really nice long shutter speed, the person had time to draw with their light source. Another example of a long shutter speed. This is a great example of a long shutter speed. This particular artist actually created different light tools. He made his own tools to get that kind of stamped effect. And this picture actually is most likely a composition of multiple pictures stuck together. So they probably had to do a couple of tries to get the wings. How do you think this picture was made? Definitely using a tripod, and then putting a string on a glow stick and just spinning it around the person a couple of times while the camera is taking the picture, with, again, a nice long or slow shutter speed. And you can get some really crazy and really neat looking pictures with long exposure. And again, with long exposure, you have the ability to kind of track movements. This is a really good example of using a long exposure to track movements. You can see the path of the cars at night on the highway. Again, so this person used a long or a slow exposure with a camera on a tripod, and they were able to track the movements of these cars. And you don't always have to do long exposure at night. You can also do it in the daytime. So if you take a look at this, if you notice, the water looks really blurry and kind of smooth because that's moving. Because it's moving, it's going to get a blur with a long exposure versus really distinctive waves you would get with a short exposure. But the rocks look crisp and the leaves look crisp because those aren't moving. So take a look at this picture of Times Square. And this picture was taken over 2 minutes. It had a 2-minute long exposure. And no, it's not because of COVID and social distancing. There's actually a ton of people and cars in this picture. The only thing is the cars in the pictures are moving. Nothing is staying still for 2 minutes in Times Square. How did they get this picture? Oh, you guys are so smart, so bright. The girl stood for 10 seconds, while everyone else around her was moving. So you can see the blurred effect of her. So this picture was a really, really neat one. And this is people really testing things out and being really creative in the way that they're thinking. What they did is they attached a glow stick onto a fan, and the fan they clipped onto a tripod and spun the tripod around in order to take that picture. Really cool. So again, exposure is the amount of light that it takes to create a picture. And remember, photography is just light that is recorded. ISO, shutter speed, and aperture all affect the exposure or the amount of light that's used to create a picture. And the shorter the shutter speed, the darker the picture, and more like you're going to be freezing time, versus the longer the shutter speed, the lighter the picture, and more of a blur. So as you are doing this, I want you to really try to think creatively and don't be afraid to experiment. Experimenting is the most important part. So 1, make sure that you guys are moving past the cliche. So the photo on the right is cliche. Things like writing words with a sparkler, you guys are way beyond that. push yourself to think about what the entire photograph looks like. What is the effect that you are going for? Both this picture and this picture are really good examples of trying to create an effect or an overall scene through their long exposure. Experiment with who and what moves. So for instance, is it the camera that's moving, or is it the model that's moving? Does the light move? Experiment with the light effects and your light sources. Are you using Christmas lights? Are you using your cell phone? Do you have a disco ball? Are you putting light underneath a colored piece of plastic? I don't know. Think about it. Try and test different things. Don't be afraid to experiment. The best photos come from experimentation. You can also experiment with your exposure time. Try a really, really long multiple second exposure. Try a slightly quicker exposure. See what happens. See what you get. Here's a hint though. If you are working with another person, make sure that you are doing a really good job communicating. So make sure whoever is clicking the shutter button counts down 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. So the person who is modeling knows how much time you have. If you are working by yourself, make sure that you are using the timer. Also, do things where you experiment with the focus and experiment with the scene itself. You guys can get some really cool and really interesting things, and I cannot wait to see what you do. All right, have a good one.